This video is going to be very late being uploaded, so I'm just going to go ahead and jump into it. Hi everyone, my name is Rose, also known as TA Summers. Welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be my October wrap-up for the month of, it's going to be my wrap-up for the month of October of 2022. So essentially, I'm going to go through all of the books that I was able to read in the month and give you my thoughts about them. It really wasn't that many. October was the month that I started a bunch of books but struggled to finish any of them in terms of stuff. So the amount of books that I actually ended up finishing were a lot smaller than what I would typically read in a month. So I finished about, if you count all the books including in one book as an omnibus, like it was actually 12 books. But since one of them was an omnibus, like I really just only finished like 10 books, and then 2 were rereads. So essentially I'm going to go through each of these books. 2 of these books I'm not going to go into too much detail about because that's a topic for a separate video that I'm going to do. But I will go through in more detail, even mark some spoiler warnings, like for some of the books that are a part of the series. I still want to be able to designate that for anyone who actually wants to read the series that I talk about, especially since some of these are like the second or the third book in a particular series. So without further ado, let's go ahead and begin. So first off, to give you some stats in terms of what I read one classic piece of literature. I read 4 horror, 2 of which could be considered YA, and I'll get into that in a little bit. 3 graphic novels or manga. 2 sci-fi fantasy, 4 technically speaking if you count the individual books inside the omnibus. 1 adult romance, and technically speaking that is adult romance / erotica, like it's a novella, so I'll get to that when I get to it. And then 2 of these could be considered ARC or Galley for NetGalley. So I had them as digital copies from NetGalley, but I also had one of them kind of like, I had the e-book for it, but I also had the audiobook for it. So I was able to read it that way. So just to give you that. And then my star ratings. I had 1 2-star for the month of October. 1 2.5 star in the month of October. 1 3-star. 2 3.5 stars, 4 4 stars, which is a pretty good reading month for me, and then 1 5-star. And if you know how rarely I give 5 stars, that is kind of an impressive feat. So basically I will be going into each of these individual books in terms of my rating and my thoughts about them. So it's interesting to reflect on my reading month for the month of October of 2022, because at this point in time, at the time that I'm filming this in November, I've already surpassed the number of books that I've read in the whole month of October for November. So I'm gonna probably do with this is just go in the order that I was able to pick each of these books up, and then just tell you kind of a summary of what each of my thoughts were about each of these different books. So the first one that I want to feature is technically a reread, but it's one that I have not read in a number of years, and that is Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. This was a very difficult book to reread. It's the first time that I've actually picked it up and read it from start to finish, so I didn't count it as like a book that I read completely, because I remember picking this up when I was in my, probably around like the time that I went to college, and I had started it and had really enjoyed the writing style of Toni Morrison's writing, but there were certain pieces of it that thematically I was not ready for at the time that I picked it up. I appreciated the writing, but the content of it was too much for me to be able to pick up. And then later on, I decided to kind of finish the latter part of it, skipping over that section entirely because of how much it disturbed me. And I finished it, and I actually really, this was the first time that I've experienced it on audio and reading it from start to finish. So essentially, The Bluest Eye, and it's considered a banned book. I wanted to originally read this during Banned Books Month, for the month of September, like towards the end of September, but unfortunately I wasn't able to fit it into my reading because it wasn't available from my library. But I did pick it up and I was able to read it on Libby, and it is narrated by Toni Morrison herself. So she does a wonderful job of narrating this particular book. But it is a very difficult book to read for the nature of several trigger warnings within it. So I would advise, if you are picking up this book, just be aware of some of the thematic themes of racism, of sexual abuse, of emotional abuse, of difficult things, including the abuse of an animal. Just be aware of what you're getting into before you get into this book, because it's not an easy read to be able to pick up. So essentially, when I picked up the Bluest Eye, the summary of this is at its heart, it's about an 11-year-old black girl named Peccola who essentially wants to she's a black girl who wants to have blue eyes. And this novel gets into the heart of why she has that particular mentality. She thinks she has a certain standard of beauty in her head, and she thinks that having blue eyes will make her more acceptable and more liked by people around her. And you kind of walk through how she internalized that particular thought while exploring the abuse that she suffers through in her family, as well as her family story leading up to the present in terms of Peccola's experiences. And it's told from the perspective of the 9-year-old protagonist, who is the foster sister of Peccola. So she's essentially a friend of Peccola, and tries to support her in every way that she can and be a friend. But it's heartbreaking to watch these girls in terms of the experiences that they have, as well as Peccola's family history in terms of where it marches to the present, in terms of how the family endures a lot of abusive relationships, a lot of trauma that's unpacked, and on the emotional toil that it takes on each of the characters. So it was something that I appreciated in terms of the not only the study of the characters in terms of what their experiences did to them emotionally, physically, psychologically, but it also made me appreciate in terms of being able to see the effects of that, and being able to feel them like just kind of working through that trauma. But it's heartbreaking to see in terms of how that trauma impacts each of the characters, and how the direction of it's a traumatic story, it's a sad story, and it's difficult to read, but it was still a read that I appreciated at its heart because of what it chooses to delve into. So I gave this book, as much as I love the audiobook narration, and as much as I love the way that it explores the themes, and how intimate and intricate it is in terms of highlighting all of these issues and the characters themselves, I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, because there were certain points of it that did not work for me in terms of how it chose to examine that trauma, especially with how vivid um, some of the depictions and descriptions are in this particular book. It may not necessarily be the case for all readers who pick this up. Some people may love it because of how intimate and how brutal it can be, and how emotionally evocative that it is. But for me, I knew that it was a little bit too much for me to handle in terms of how graphic it chose to be, but I still appreciated the read. So overall, I would give Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye 3 out of 5 stars. So the second book that I finished in the month of October is actually an omnibus fantasy series, sci-fi slash fantasy romance series, that I had mentioned that I was going to tackle on my TBR before, and I did end up reading all of the omnibus stories. This is the Kinsmen Universe by Ilona Andrews. And this is a collection of stories that were individually printed and have since gone out of print, but it was reprinted in 2018. So I picked that up for myself, and I wanted to read each of the stories in this in preparation for reading the third book in the Kinsman series. So this is the first two books in the Kinsmen Universe, as well as a short side story that kind of accompanies the same universe. So I'm going to go through each of these particular books in this omnibus and tell you my thoughts about them. So the first book in this particular omnibus that is featured in the Kinsmen Universe is Silent Blade. And this is the story of an assassin who decides that she wants to get out of the trade that she's in. She is a former member of a well-to-do family. Her name is Melly. And Melly essentially has been working behind the scenes as a trained assassin in trying to help her family, which is kind of a high profile family, but she disassociates herself from the family in order to have her freedom and be able to do things while also trying to support them in any way that she can. But she decides, I don't want to be an assassin anymore. Let me go ahead and do my thing. But then her brother visits her and decides to say, like, our family needs you to do one last thing. And she's essentially told that the last assignment that she wants that her brother and her family wants her to do is kill the man who essentially ruined their family's life. So essentially, Melly is targeting Celino Carvana, and Celino Carvana is a member of a high-profile family who had been had arranged a marriage with Melly's family in order to kind of secure their status in the universe. And that marriage fell through. It tore the Melly's family apart and essentially led her to get her freedom by disassociating with her family and having to do the assassinations. So when she essentially makes a plan to assassinate Celino, and she ends up reuniting with him, like he does not recognize who she is. Story capitalizes on like that tension of like unspoken knowledge, like in terms of like her knowing him but him not recognizing her. And the way that their dynamic is portrayed is not only like very full of chemistry and nuance, but it's also very alluring to watching. You're wondering um like whether or not they're gonna actually get together, or what the fallout is going to be like when he actually ends up recognizing her. So I'm not going to spoil anything for events. That's just kind of like the basic setup of the novel. But I thought that as like I really believe the chemistry of the characters, and I really like the establishment of the world and the setting, and the intimacy of detail given to the environment that is built in the Kinsman universe. But I felt that this particular story was a little bit too short for me to really like sink my feet into. It ended like a bit abruptly, more abruptly than I was expecting it to, and so that took away from my enjoyment a little bit. So I enjoyed the story overall, but I just felt like it was just a little bit too short. If it had been a little bit longer in terms of establishing the dynamic to them, I think I would have rated it higher. So I rated this first story, Silent Blade, 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next novel in the collection was Silver Shark. And this particular novel in the Kinsman universe was my favorite of the 3 stories. I really enjoyed how well thought out this particular novel was. This is essentially about Claire, who is a powerful soldier who can manipulate, has the ability to fight and kill with her mind. And she's a part of a ongoing generational conflict between two different societies, and she's in her military team who essentially is going on this particular mission. But as the mission goes forward and stuff like that, like as you see the dynamic of what she's trying to do in the fight, unfortunately, she is on the losing team, and she's the only one who survives in her particular unit after an assassination attempt, and essentially she's taken captive and made to be a refugee and banished to a planet which I believe is Rada. I believe that's how you pronounce it, Rada. So she's essentially banished to this planet Rada after being on the losing side of this conflict, and she's essentially like given a new name and a new identity. Because if people found out her actual capabilities and stuff like that, they would kill her on sight. So she's given the chance to kind of like rebuild her identity and things like that, and made to work for a powerful employer who is on the opposite side of who she's fighting. And if she's discovered to be who she is, like I said, she'll be killed on sight. But her new boss is one who takes a liking to her almost immediately. His name is Venturo, who is considered to be a psyker, and psychers are Claire's natural enemy, and she does not want to be discovered. She has had to layer her mind to the point where her mind can't be read, since psychers are people who have the ability to read minds and undiscover people for who they are, like in terms of emotions and things like that. So Claire's essentially has to build a buffer in her mind to keep from being discovered. And so she dyes her hair. She keeps the layers of protection in her mind in order to avoid being protected, even though she finds an attraction in her boss, Venturo, and he has a definite immediate reaction and attraction to her. And so essentially, this particular story is an exploration of actually harrowing situations where the two are put in direct opposition of each other, and it goes between different action scenes. I thought the action scenes and the establishment of the world and the environment and the conflict was very well done. And you're wondering essentially when the other shoe will drop in terms of him discovering her, even though she knows who he is. He doesn't know her, and the process of like actually like her revealing his identity to him is actually one that's like kind of leaves you on your toes, like what is he going to do. But I thought this was actually a well done story in terms of establishing their connection with each other and their eventual relationship. And then the couple from the previous story actually makes a brief appearance in this one, so I appreciate that cameo very much. But overall, this was my favorite story of the collection. I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars, and this was one that like I consider definitely among my favorites when it comes to sci-fi romance. So that is Silver Shark by Alona Andrews, and it's contained in the Kinsmen Universe. So the last story, I don't have too much to say about it because it is a short story and it is just an accompanying story for the particular universe in this book. This is a mere formality, and essentially this is a story of Deidre, who is undertaking a particular task at an event in which a former lord is falls under unfortunate circumstances, and a new lord has to ascend to this particular status, like in this particular world. And so she's offered as a potential love interest, like mediary, like in terms of stuff. And she's undertaking the task of meeting with this lord and coming to terms to where she's avoiding societies, different societies fighting each other. But unfortunately, for her, like she gets into the situation where the young lord takes a liking to her and like basically like trying to woo her, like in terms of things. And so like some of it is a bit dated in terms of the humor, and some of it is a bit kind of like disjointed in terms of like how it establishes its conflict and ultimate resolution. I thought it was okay, but it wasn't the strongest story in this collection for me. So overall, I gave it 3 out of 5 stars because I did enjoy the establishment of the characters and the environment, but I didn't particularly care for um it because it didn't strike me as strongly as the previous two stories. And so, like, it was a standalone story that could take place in this particular universe, but it didn't resonate with me the same way as Silent Blade and Silver Shark. So I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. So, taking into consideration all the stories in this particular collection, I gave it overall a 4 out of 5 stars. And so I would definitely recommend reading it, and I really enjoyed it, and it should prepare me to read the third book in the Kinsmen Universe, which is, I believe, Faded Blades. So the third book that I read in the month of October of 2022 is actually a manga. This is the second volume in this particular series. In Japan, it's known as Sayonara's miniskirt or Goodbye miniskirt, but in America, it's known by a different name. This is Not Your Idol by Aoi Makino. And this is the cover for the second volume. So there are going to be mild spoilers for this particular manga. If you would like to skip that out, skip this particular part, I will put the timestamp up for your reference. But essentially, the non-spoilery part of this particular review is that this is a continuation of a series in which a girl named Nina is a former idol who was brutally attacked, and essentially she has to take on another identity. She's cut her hair and she has a more boyish look, and she moves to a different school in terms of trying to blend in and fit in, apart from her idol past. And she ends up meeting a boy from her class who actually ends up discovering who she is. And essentially, she does not. She's on edge because the person who attacked her as an idol is still out on the loose, and she doesn't know who to trust. And essentially, for the establishment of this particular series, she has to navigate having a secret identity while also not essentially knowing and also grapple with like her particular relationships and things like that under this new identity. So her identity as Nina is the one that is the cover name, but her idol name is Karen. So I'm going to get into specific spoilers for this particular volume after this particular timestamp. So I'll give you a moment to skip. 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's talk about volume 2. So essentially, this particular volume picks up after the events of the first volume, in which Nina and Hikaru, who is the student who discovers her identity after the events of the first novel, and he establishes a connection with her in terms of having the attack on his sister, and like how much that affects him. When he learns what happened to Nina, he feels guilty and he really wants to protect her. And Nina is uncertain because she does not know if not only does she not know if Hikaru is actually the person who may have attacked her, because at the end of the first volume you kind of like have this doubt in terms of like people in Nina's life who think that Hikaru might have been the person who attacked her. But in this particular volume, she reveals that there's a specific mark that's on him, that's like maybe like I think a triad of 3 moles, if I remember correctly. Let me see if I can find that here. Yeah, this is the page that shows it. So like she identified her attacker like in terms of what he looked like and having that particular distinction. And so what he does to gain her trust is he takes his shirt off. Unintentional fan service or intentional fan service, take your pick. But essentially, he gains her trust by realizing that he's not the person that means to harm her. That he's actually telling the truth and wants to gain her trust. So that leaves the question as to who is in the shadows, like trying to manipulate things and trying to go after Nina, in essentially like in this volume. But there's also a rival by the name is Miku Nagasu, and she's essentially rivaling Nina for affections of Hikaru. So like there's kind of a love triangle going on through there. The problem that I had with this particular novel is essentially what happens to Miku in this sense of things that transpire in this volume. And I'm not going to get into it because it is a like a trigger warning situation. It's not a good sign, but essentially Miku is put in a position where like she has been manipulated by this particular person in the shadows who is also coming after Nina. So it sets up a wedge of conflict in terms of things that transpire in the manga volume, where all these three characters are affected by tragedy, and this person who is waiting in the shadows who wants to bring down Nina in any way, shape, or form. And I'm I realized that this particular manga series is on hiatus in Japan, but I do think that this says a lot of like interesting things and valuable things in terms of how women are perceived in society, and um, like being subjected to this kind of fear and this kind of violence in terms of the difficult topics that this manga goes into, between stalking, between um, like the violence that Nina has been subjected to, as well as Miku, and as well as Hikaru's sister. I think it does well with showcasing the seriousness and the emotions that are behind that. The problem that I had with this particular novel was also the other piece of it, like in terms of in between all the traumatic situations, there's this sense of rivalry that pits Miku against Nina, and that part of it I didn't like as much in terms of the way that it was done, but I do think that there is potential for this to be resolved in a way that is sensitive to the issues that and the emotions that each of the characters are going to. I hope that we're able to see that in future volumes when the mangaka can pick up the series and releases more volumes. But I did really like this volume. I liked it about as much as the first volume of this series, and I'm looking forward to reading more of it when it does come out. But I gave this a total of 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the artwork as well as the attention to detail in terms of not just the character emotions but also the issues at hand. And I'm excited to read more from Aoi Makino. So the next book that I want to feature is Anti-Romance by Shoko Hidaka, and this is the first manga volume special edition in this particular series. And I think what makes it a specifically special edition is the illustrations that are included within it. You can kind of see like at the end of it that it includes color illustrations. This is a really nice showcase of the artwork. I'll give you another one that I actually really enjoyed. This one right here too. This is you could call it a yaoi series, I believe. Like, this is essentially about two 24-year-olds who are roommates who have been friends for quite some time, and they've been roommates for about 6 years, living in the same apartment. It's So and Rio, and So is a works as a hairstylist who is not exactly perceptive of other people's feelings, and he's told that specifically, like as a hairstylist, by his boss, in terms of saying, hey, you're not good at this customer service and you have to be more perspective and kind of be on top of things. So has to grapple with that, like in terms of his day-to-day life, and it shows you kind of like the intermediary of the day-to-day lives of both of these gentlemen. So that's So's life. Rio, who is who's the darker haired gentleman that's on this cover, So is the one with the blonde hair. I don't know if you can see that. And the darker haired gentleman is Rio. So Rio is an up and coming writer who is um, struggles to kind of like emotionally talk about his own feelings, and he struggles with that even though he's dedicated to his work, and he's like, kind of more no nonsense. And so essentially this particular manga volume is exploring the relationship between these two, how they met, and essentially how their feelings have changed for each other in the time that they have lived with each other, like growing more closer than friends, even in terms of like their dynamic with each other, especially since they find themselves having other relationships in terms of stuff, and then wondering like will they, won't they, without going into too many spoilers about it. But I really like this volume. I thought it was very well done in terms of the slice of life aspect and also exploring the feelings between Sol and Rio. And I hope to be able to read more into this particular series because it was very appealing to me, like in terms of the artwork, in terms of handling the characters, and like there it's not a comedic manga. It's more like there are moments that are more lighthearted, and then there are more moments that are more serious. But it felt to me like it did a great job with exploring the not only the individual characters' lives but also their relationship with each other. And the point where it leads off is an appropriate one in terms of like being a jumping point in terms of what would be the next step in terms of them deepening that relationship and seeing where it goes. So I enjoyed this. I give this 4 out of 5 stars, and I really liked it in among my reads of October, and that is Anti Romance by Shoko Hidaka. So the fifth book that I read in the month of October is one that I have probably a controversial opinion with. And it is from a very popular fantasy series. A lot of people think this is a YA fantasy series, but it is actually an adult fantasy series. And a lot of people know of Naomi Novik as the author of Uprooted, as well as Spinning Silver, as well as the Tremere series. I believe that's the series with the dragons on it. I'll put covers up of these for your reference. I have not read the Tremere series. I have read Uprooted and I have read Spinning Silver. I've had conflicted opinions about Uprooted, but I did really like Spinning Silver, and that was actually one of my favorite novels from Novik to date. But I went into this particular series that I'm going to mention the final book from. This is from the Dark Academia series, Scholomance. This is the Golden Enclaves. And essentially, I read this on audiobook, and I was able to. I really enjoyed the audiobook narrator for that. I will put her name up on this for your reference because I can't recall it right offhand at the time that I'm filming this, but I want to give attention to her performance because her performance was what had me enjoy this particular audio novel as much as I did, because there were a lot of things that I did not like about this particular novel. And I said this in my review. Unfortunately, I have never, like, it's been a while since I have come across a fantasy series that dropped the ball as hard as the Golden Enclaves did for this particular series, because like it's hard to talk about without going into significant spoilers. I can tell you from in terms of this particular series that the basic facets of it before I go into too much detail about it. I'll put a spoiler warning like up before it comes up into too many detailed spoilers. But the basic premise of the series is that it's following a girl named Galadriel, also known as Elle, who is a biracial teenager who is essentially weaving dark magic at this magic school in which everything is a test and is out to get you. So all of these students who are learning magic essentially have to learn magic in order to survive. So Elle basically is makes tentative alliances like with the people who she attends classes with and things like that. But a lot of people are turned off by her because of her ability to wield dark and dangerous magic, and they fear that she is this harbinger of dark magic and ill will, and will turn to the dark side in terms of stuff if she continues to do things. And so Elle basically has this very pessimistic attitude. She doesn't start out having really any friends, and kind of keeps to herself and tries to survive as best that she can, at least in terms of the events of the first novel, which is Deadly Education. Essentially, like, Elle meets other students within the school that she has to survive and like make a lot, like I said, tentative alliances with in order to be able to get through to the next grade level. And they learn like not only like different spells, like in terms of the resources of the school, but there are no teachers, there are no like, you know, structured environments. Like it's very more hands off in terms of this environment, that they have to learn these spells and be able to pick them up and wield them in order to survive, because literally anything can kill them. And for the first two books, A Deadly Education as well as The Last Graduate, you follow these students who are trying to survive the school in both things, like surviving like one particular grade level, and then trying to make it to graduation, like in order to survive. So that's the basic premise of A Deadly Education as well as The Last Graduate. So, like, without going into too many spoilers. So now that you know this, I'm going to go into spoilers for the last book in a little bit. I will tell you that, like, despite having specific criticisms of both A Deadly Education and The Last Graduate, I still enjoyed those books very much, and I was looking forward to at least seeing where the Golden Enclaves would go into it. So I'm going to warn you that I'm going to go into specific spoilers for this particular part of the video. 3, 2, 1, and look at the timestamp here to skip to. 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's talk about the Golden Enclaves. So essentially, this particular book starts off where the last book left off. So something I did not mention, like in kind of the basic part of this particular video, like for the first two books, was that Elle has a rival named Orion, who she's essentially been like kind of a foil to. The two of them like have like opposite perspectives. That both of them are very powerful and have been a resource for the younger students and other students in the school to look up to. Orion is seen as the good like warlock, and essentially Elle is seen as the bad person, but like given the tentative alliances, they've essentially worked together to be able to get out of the school. And then the last part of The Last Graduate, Orion pushes Elle through the portal to get her out of the school in an attempt to save her, even though the two are in love with each other, as insinuated by multiple interactions they've had like throughout the first two books of the series. So that being said, when we start out with the Golden Enclaves, essentially Elle is grappling with the fact that Orion was left behind and fighting a maw mouth by himself, and essentially like she believes that he may have died. And she is grappling with a lot of emotions in terms of his loss, and like actually like, you know, like being in love with him, and like, you know, wanting a relationship with him and stuff like that, and also being angry at the fact that he pushed her through the portal, and then not the possibility of him not surviving. So the book explores that grief for the first part of it, and has her tentatively align with a character named Liesel, who was essentially an antagonist through the first two books of this particular series, and even to the point where Liesel tried to kill Elle at one point. So it didn't make sense to me, like in terms of how this particular novel chose to showcase their relationship. I have complicated thoughts about how Liesel's character was done, because she's essentially like a secondary character in the um first two books, and she's not even as close to Elle as some of the other characters that are established. So her becoming a main character for this book, I'm not opposed to the fact that she became a main character in this particular book, but the fact that the way that she was done in terms of establishing a relationship with Elle, and you see like there's an established LGBT sapphic romance between um Elle and Liesel that's shown, but at the same time, it doesn't feel like there's any true chemistry between them. And you see Elle and Liesel go through these different adventures and things like that, learning spells and things like that in this particular thing, but they don't really have any character chemistry. So essentially, when spoiler warning, like in terms of things, Orion comes back into the picture, he's actually alive, and he's actually like he's not okay, but he is alive, and there are certain revelations that come across with his particular character that change the game in terms of Elle's perception of him. Liesel's character is kind of pushed aside and kind of forgotten about in the spectrum of the narrative, and I thought that the way that was done was not okay, because you follow like you see a relationship that is established with them, and like that's one thing, even though like they don't really have a strong chemistry as Elle had with other characters, so it didn't make sense to me in terms of her role being what it was to just be pushed aside. The other part of it is something that I've had problems with the overarching narrative, in which Orion's role, which was much more prominent in the last two books, albeit he had a major role in the first book, and his role was pulled back a bit in the second book. But you would think that like he would have his role would be like explained more, considering the fact that Elle grieves him so much in this novel. His character is essentially reduced even more in this novel, to the point where the only lens that you're really seeing him through up to certain interactions and things like that is through Elle's lens and perspective, and it's hard to really get a grasp in terms of why that was done, considering he had such a more pronounced role in the beginning of this series. I didn't understand that at all, and I talked about this in my review as well, which I'll link down below in terms of talking about it. But this the way that it was done, and then subsequently getting to the point where you have this final showdown that's telegraphed by Elle, like where the characters who had more prominent roles in the first two books of the series like are kind of like just reduced to like intermediaries, like that aren't really featured much at all in this last piece, just didn't make sense to me at all, and it felt like it was shortchanging all the characters apart from Elle. There were bits and pieces of this that I appreciated in terms of Elle's background, and then being able to learn how she was manipulated and how and what her father's history was apart from her mother's side of the family. I found those parts to be fine, and the exploration of grief to be fine, but it was so sluggish in terms of the presentation, and it was so threadbare when it came to portraying like some of these characters, where one character was featured prominently where they had very little had a presence but not as pronounced, and yet the other characters who had more pronounced roles were reduced to essentially like just mentions. So I didn't understand that decision. I felt like this book meandered and was way too long and drawn out, to the point where things really weren't happening, and things narrative decisions that didn't make sense to me. So when the ending came in terms of like establishing its themes of authority and things like that, in terms of having kind of like a neat little bow tied to it, like for its particular ending, it didn't feel satisfying to me the way that it ended. So I essentially gave this particular novel in the series 2 out of 5 stars. It was deeply disappointing to me. Like, I didn't have as much of an investment in it as other people did, so like I recognize its flaws, but I just wish that it could have been. It had the potential to be a much stronger series than what it did, and that deeply disappointed me. I definitely did not think that this was the strongest of Novik's work that I have read. And I've had my criticisms of things that Novik has done, like in her previous novels, whether it be Uprooted or Spinning Silver. But at the same time, like I could see, like, like for those standalone novels, I could see like where the characters were going and things like that. Whereas with this particular series, with this series being the first series that I've read from Novik, I had heard criticisms of like her previous series having trouble with character consistency and things like that, and I definitely saw that here in this particular series. So unfortunately, I was disappointed, and I did not have as high of an opinion of it as I wanted to. And I know that this particular novel was nominated under the Goodreads Choice Awards, but I did not think that it was one of the better reads that I've had for this particular year. I'm not saying that it was a bad novel. I'm just saying that it had the potential to be so much better than what it was, given the level of detail and the level of ideas. I understood where the ideas were coming from, but the execution was not grand. So that was The Golden Enclaves by Naomi Novik, and I gave this 2 out of 5 stars.